Shana Tova. A story. In 1981, self-made multimillionaire Eugene Lang visited PS 121, an elementary school in East Harlem. He had been invited to speak to the graduating class of 61 kids about their potential and inspire them with his own story. But Lang knew that no matter what he said, his words likely wouldn't matter. The principal had told him that in the absolute best case scenario, only one out of those 61 kids would go to college. And statistically, more than 75% of them would drop out of high school. What business, Lang thought, do I have speaking to these children about hope? Why should they believe me? And so Lang scrapped his planned speech and on a whim promised the kids that he would pay the full college tuition of every single one of them if they made it through high school. It was a spontaneous offer, but also a serious one. He followed through. And not only that, Lang kept in touch with the students. To quote an article about him, Eugene Lang's wisdom was that he spent the money to follow up. He hired someone to keep track of the kids and their families and offered counseling, tutoring, field trips, writing workshops, guest speakers, and newsletters. Lang became a kind of surrogate parent, encouraging the children to visit his office and talk about their problems, their hopes, and their dreams. Lang's wisdom carried 90% of those kids through to high school graduation. To quote the man himself, it's very simple. A child who believes they have a future has one. But it wasn't just about his money. It was about his expectations. Rosanna Serrano, one of Lang's kids and an economics major at Barnard College, put it this way: you have to start molding a kid's mind early so that they say, what kind of question is that if I'm going to college or not? Of course I am. If Eugene Lang was right in believing that only those who believe in the future have one, then this Rosh Hashanah, it's fair to ask, how do we believe in the future? How do we have hope? And how, like Eugene Lang, do we give hope? Especially right now, with climate change, the war in Ukraine, inflation and the markets, political polarization, and the Taliban regaining control of Afghanistan. Recently, the news has been so upsetting that a few months ago, when I asked a group of GRS congregants what kind of adult education classes they wanted this year, I heard this repeated over and over again: anything, as long as it's not depressing. I just can't take any more. I don't think these members are alone in their despair, which raises the question, why bother with the new year if so much feels so broken? There's more than one answer to that question, but let's start right here. Today, Rosh Hashanah begins the yearly process of what Judaism calls teshuvah. Teshuvah can be roughly translated as turning, return, or repentance, and it is the central theme of our high holiday season. This is a turning back to ourselves and our potential, and a turning to God or the holy as well. But it's also a turning away from grudges held, wrongs done, cruelties justified, and pessimism. Teshuvah is an acknowledgement of all that is broken and wounded and painful inside us and all around us. And it is also a promise that it can be healed and fixed. Teshuvah assures us that with enough conviction, commitment, and action, anything can be made right. But where does this faith in repair, this faith in fixing come from? It comes from God. See, teshuvah is theological. It claims that even if we give up on ourselves, or if we give up on the world, the holy never does. Judaism has faith in us, in our wholeness, our holiness, and our innate goodness, so that no matter what we may have done, or what may have been done to us, or even how far we may have strayed, or even how bad the world outside seems. Judaism insists on a positive view of human potential and goodness. It believes we can change ourselves. It believes we can change the world. Another story. In 1986, Jane Goodall, the world's leading primatologist and anthropologist, attended a conference called Understanding Chimpanzees. And at that conference, she attended a session on conservation, which she found utterly shocking. There, she learned that chimpanzees' forests were being felled at a horrifying rate. They were being caught in poachers' snares, and the so-called bushmeat trade, the commercial hunting of wild animals for food, had begun. Chimpanzee numbers had plummeted since 1960, from somewhere over 1 million to an estimated 400,000 to 500,000. It is much less now. Goodall explained that for her, this was a wake-up call. I went to the conference as a scientist, planning to continue working in the field. I left as an advocate for the chimpanzees and their vanishing forest home. I knew that to try to help chimpanzees, I must leave the field and do my best to try to raise awareness and hope so that we could start to halt at least some of the destruction. And so after spending 26 years of my life doing what I loved best in the place I loved best, I took to the road. And the more I traveled around the world giving lectures, attending conferences, meeting with conservationists and legislatures, the more I realized the extent of the devastation we're wreaking on the planet. It was not just the forests harboring chimpanzees and other African animals that were endangered. It was forests and animals everywhere. And not only forests, but all of the natural world. And then Goodall went on to explain how despite the fact that science suggests that we are on the end of a 6th extinction caused by human actions, she has, against all odds, found reasons to hope. Almost all of these reasons begin with one person resolving to do something. To quote Goodall, "There is Old Blue, at one time the very last female black robin in the world, who with the help of an inspired biologist saved her species from extinction. There's the individual tree, the very last of its kind, that having been almost eaten to death by browsing goats, was killed by a forest fire, yet found the energy to produce seeds on its last living branch. With the help of horticulturists, the species sprang back, like the phoenix, from the ashes." That is Teshuvah in action. From one last surviving robin, a whole species is saved. From one last branch, a forest of nearly extinct trees grows. Because all it takes is one person. In fact, Oxford philosopher William McCaskill, the author of a book entitled What We Owe the Future, describes people like Goodall, who insist on hope in terrible time, as moral weirdos. In an interview with Ezra Klein, he explained it this way: "A moral weirdo is someone who believes things that are not widely accepted by society. Perhaps they're even looked down upon or ridiculed. Nonetheless, they stand up for what they believe in. Abolitionists," McCaskill explains in his book, "were once moral weirdos. Feminists, moral weirdos. Nelson Mandela, another moral weirdo. People who insist on hope and human kindness in a world that seems devoid of it are, most often, those who change the world." Judaism is a tradition that has produced many moral weirdos. Theodor Herzl is perhaps the best known moral weirdo. I mean, most of his contemporaries thought he should be committed. A Jewish state in the middle of the desert, a desert controlled by the British. All those refined Austrian and German Jews are going to move to the desert and live on communal farms. We'll believe it when we see it. Yitzhak Rabin, insisting on the possibility of peace, another moral weirdo. And Moses, the man who believed that an enslaved people could be free, the original and ultimate moral weirdo. So why have we cornered the market on moral weirdos? Because hope against the odds and faith despite despair is a foundational Jewish value. The vision of a world redeemed and at peace, the insistence that things will get better, is expressed in the prayers we say, in our very origin story, the journey from slavery to freedom, and in our persistence as a people despite a terrible and tragic history. For us, hope is not optional. It's the only way forward. It's also an obligation, codified during the medieval period. Maimonides, one of our greatest rabbis, in his famous document, The 13 Principles of Faith, declared that one could not consider oneself a Jew without the belief in a messianic age. That is, the conviction that one day we would live in a world of equality, justice, and compassion, where no one goes without. So great was that commitment to a better world that it is woven into our daily and weekly prayers, a promise repeated over and over again by Jews all over the world, even and especially at the darkest times in Jewish history. But it's not only hope. It's hope enacted. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of our greatest rabbis, famously said, "If you have a sapling in your hand and you are laboring to plant it, and someone says to you that the Messiah has come, stay and finish planting that tree. Only then go and greet the Messiah." Whether the future is worth hoping for depends on us planting those trees, no matter the world outside. Hope depends on us. Because we are not in Judaism meant to be receivers of hope. We are meant to be givers of hope and enactors of hope. We have hope by giving it, so that when things are at their worst and we cannot imagine them getting better, we act. We turn off the TV. We stop believing that the headlines in the news are the only possible future, and do, even if everyone around us thinks we're moral weirdos. We act again and again in small ways until they add up and a whole species is saved. This is why in Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, chapter 3, one of the most important codes of Jewish law ever written, he writes this: "It is necessary for every person to behold themselves as equally balanced between merit and guilt, and look upon the entire world as if evenly balanced between merit and guilt. Thus, if they perform one sin, they tip the balance and that of the entire world to the side of sin and bring destruction. On the other hand, if a person performs one mitzvah, they tip the balance and that of the entire world to the side of merit and bring salvation to themselves and others. This is implied in the line of Proverbs. A righteous person is the foundation of the entire world. That is, the one who acts righteously tips the balance of the entire world and thereby saves it." That is, each of us here today might, with just one action, tip the balance of the world and save it. Because as Jews, our hope is not in a God that acts while we watch, waiting in the wings. Our hope is in ourselves and each other. We don't just believe in tshuva, in repair. We bring it. To quote Rebecca Solnit, activist, public intellectual, and Jew, "Cause and effect assumes that history marches forward, but history is not an army. It is a crab scuttling sideways, a drip of soft water wearing away stone, an earthquake breaking centuries of tension. Sometimes one person inspires a movement, or her words do decades later. Sometimes a few passionate people change the world. Sometimes they start a mass movement and millions do. Sometimes millions are stirred by the same outrage or the same ideal, and changes come upon us like a change of weather. All that these transformations have in common is that they begin in imagination, in hope. To hope is to gamble. It's to bet on the future, your desires, on the possibility that an open heart and uncertainty is better than gloom and safety. To hope is dangerous, and yet it is the opposite of fear, for to live is to risk. I say all this, Solnit continues, because hope is not like a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. I say it because hope is an axe you use to break down doors in an emergency. Because hope should shove you out the door. Because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the world's treasures, and the grinding down of the poor and the marginal. Hope just means another world might be possible. But whether we act or not has everything to do with it, she continues. Yes, wars will break out. The planet will heat up. But how many, how hot, and what survive depends on whether or not we act. The future is dark, she writes, but it is a darkness as much of the womb as of the grave. Which brings me back to Eugene Ling. In 1981, he made a promise to 61 students. 52 of them graduated from high school and went on to college. And then in 1985, the New York Times learned what Ling had done, and they wrote a story about it. As a result of that story, more stories were written, and a national movement started. And in 1986, as a result of the publicity from the initial article, 469 more students, by then known as Eugene Ling's Dreamers, were added to his docket and given full college tuition. Soon after, Eugene Ling was featured on 60 Minutes, and as a result of that appearance, the I Have a Dream Foundation was started. By 1987, 2,543 students had been added from another 11 cities. And by 2020, the I Have a Dream Foundation had sent 10,000 students to college. It all started with a single promise. This 5783, this new year, what single promise will you make? What hope will you give? Wishing you all a sweet, a happy, and a healthy new year. May each of us find the hope that we need and give the hope that we can.